My name is Victoria Horton, and I will be presenting the first article today. And as you can see on your handouts, there is an outline, there is a thesis statement, but I would like to actually open up with a quote from the book that pertains to what my article was about. And in an entry of her diary, in our book, The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank, published in 1996 by Anchor Books, Anne says, "My work, my hope, my love, my courage, all these things keep my head above water and keep me from complaining." And this is like my favorite quote from the whole book, which was pretty cool when I found an article that related that. So basically this is what the whole article is about. And the thing I like to focus on is the work part. Because as stated by Rachel Feldhay-Brenner in her article, Writing Herself Against History, Anne Frank's Self-Portrait as a Young Artist, published in 1996 by Modern Judaism, that's the journal. Basically, she focuses on how her work from complaining, keeps her from complaining, which is basically, in other words, which is, to me, her thesis of the whole article, is that Frank, Anne, whose at young age could hardly offer a sustaining perspective of the past, drew support and strength from her aspiration to become an artist. And they're not talking about, of course, the painting artist, they're talking about the writing artist. So this is what this article was about. It was about how Anne uses her writing as a way of coping with the grim situation that she finds herself in. And in order to present this analysis of writing as a coping mechanism for Anne, Brenner actually presents the grim situation that Anne is met with, how Anne's diary helps her cope, and Anne's acknowledgement of the source of her coping. And so I'm going to go in briefly and talk about each of these three things and how she presents them in the article. The first one is the grim situation that Anne finds herself in. And to support that, Brenner presents this situation by saying, "The apocalyptic situation of the Jews in the Annex turns the configurational dimension of the ordinary everyday life in the Annex into a purposeless episodic existence. The purposelessness of such an existence is apocalyptic in itself because it evokes a self-destructive wish for hiding, for an ending, basically." So, basically what that is saying is that due to the fact, the thing is, they're hiding to keep from annihilation, but basically their fear of being exposed and facing that annihilation of the Jews is what brings this hopelessness, this despair on them, because they're like, we're basically trapped and we're waiting for the cat to find the mouse, basically. And so basically this sets Anne up for the Great Depression that we do read in her work, such as when she's talking about the bird that has had its wings ripped off. She feels like a bird who has its wings ripped off, banging itself against the cage, like there's nothing it can do to get free, but it just wants to get out. And so basically that's the depression that Anne's put up against, and normally people under that depression, like she says at one point, she doesn't care if she lives or dies. They get to where they don't care about life. But the way that Anne keeps her own hopes up, as stated by Brenner, is by writing. Because when Anne writes, as Brenner states in her article, she has to detach herself from the situation, and that helps her form an optimistic point of view of the situation. Because when you write about events, you just don't write about your emotions of the events. You have to put the reader into the events, which for her it was Kitty. And so you have to detach yourself and look at it from an outsider's perspective. And by doing that and reliving it, Anne was able to not necessarily be optimistic about the future, but it helped her forget the emotions with it. for at least a little bit. And so that helped her cope. And Anne herself in her diary talks about, like right here, how that helped her cope. And that was another thing that Brenner touched on, was that not only can we see how that helped Anne, but Anne was knowledgeable enough about herself to see how that was helping her cope with her life. And I just thought that that was a very interesting way to look at it, because normally when you read Anne Frank, people focus on the Nazi oppression of the Jews, or just the basics of hiding. But here, she focuses on an aspect that can affect even us today, because everybody has their problems, and the way to cope can be through writing. So I felt like she kind of gave it a modern take that most people might not look at as much. And with the article, I thought it was a very good article. It was 23 pages just to read it, and then it had all the notes and the references. But there is one thing that I would improve upon it, the way it was organized, because the way they wrote it was, they did go through the Grimm situation and how Anne's diary helps her cope and how Anne acknowledges that. But the way they did it was, they talked about the Grimm situation a little bit, and then how the diary helped her cope, and then Anne's acknowledgement, and then they'd go through the cycle over and over again. And I did understand that as repeating the point, kind of making sure that you get it. But for me, personally, I would have rather had all the Grimm situation put in one section, how her diary helped her cope, and Anne's acknowledgement, because that's just how I write. And I agree completely that writing was her coping mechanism. That's how I felt throughout the whole book. And I think part of that was actually in psychology, and I took a psychotherapy class. Narrative therapy is now an official therapy, which is basically what Anne does. That was what I thought was cool about the article, because I'm like, oh, I've seen this before. Because in narrative therapy, they ask you to write about your life and then become the author of your own life, which is essentially what Anne did. So I thought it was a great article. If y'all want it, just email me by my name on maconstate.edu, and it's great.
Questions? Did they make a reference to Joyce? Because the title is very much evoking James Joyce. The portrait of the artist
as a young man.
But in this case, self-portrait as a young artist. Is there a Joyce reference in there at all?
They mentioned it briefly in the beginning, but past that, they didn't really use it for the argument. One person that they did use a lot of was, I think his name was Kermode. He was the one that came up with the he was the one that wrote down the apocalyptic theory that that's how you face an apocalypse that is real. Because it is essentially the end. Like, nobody ever really thinks of their ending, but when it comes concrete like that, like with the depression and everything. But I don't think they mentioned Joyce very much in the article. I don't remember seeing her name past that introduction, or his name. That's it.
Well, no, give him a chance, because participation depends on it.
Yes.
So that article was saying that, or did it say, that Anne's optimism was kept up from her detachment into the art?
It was mostly saying that Anne did have optimism, but without a hope for the future, she wouldn't have been able to keep it up. And so by detaching herself, she got to leave her emotions for a minute, which meant that she left the sadness of it. And so she got to look to the future a little bit, so that helped her optimism.
Because I felt that she was quite optimistic. That's everything about her.
And that was how she wrote.
I don't know if I'd be able to do that in that kind of situation.
Well, and that implies, what you're saying implies kind of like a journalistic detachment that I don't see in the text. Because, I mean, I understand what you're saying, like in order to document it, because she's trying to do this for a reason, and she believes that others will read this, right? Because of the radio show. So I could see this being a journalistic endeavor, but about, even halfway through, I mean, I think it's all basically gone by the wayside. Because she's talking about, she's documenting people pooping and stuff like that, which is fine. But there's also the fits and the blahs and the 12-year-old girl and the, hormones, because 12-year-old girls just have overwhelming amounts of hormones. So I'm wondering, because it does seem like at odds to say, well, she's got this. I mean, yes, I understand it as a cathartic coping mechanism, but are they saying that she's objective, or that it's a
They're
more
not.
personal?
She does say that it is personal for Anne, but by writing it down and reliving it and just... She basically said that parts of the journal were, or the diary were like that, like objective, like you were talking about, like the schedules and everything. So she did detach herself from those, but she didn't really touch on the emotional part. She used the emotional part to describe the grim situation.
So it kind of thinks that they're going back and forth between journalism and personal diary. So at some points it's cathartic, and some points it would be more an attempt to control the situation. Is that where it's going? Okay.
Maybe therapeutic. You know that even when you write your feelings down, it has a therapeutic effect. So just writing down how you feel sometimes and looking at it. Was that part of the article, or just the focus on the article mainly focused on the work ethic being cathartic for her, right? Is that the gist of the article?
Because mainly I would have said that there was a detachment because of how emotional she gets in some of these entries.
Right.
In fact, she's berating herself. Like, how could I think this way about my family and stuff? So for that article to say there's attachment, I just don't see it in a way that the article's meant to be. So,
Do you see?
Oh, okay, that's how this will be the last one. Okay.
Do you see any other possible purpose for the journal other than it being because I'm sure she didn't. She obviously didn't start it to be therapeutic. She started it to write down her thoughts. At the very beginning, she's like, and this is Joey, and this is so and so, and she's a jerk, and he is obviously in love with me, and this, that, and the other. I mean, it obviously wasn't started just to be therapeutic. Do you think there was any other purpose to it? Like she also didn't start it knowing it would be published. That came later.
Right.
Much
Yeah.
later.
She would have. Yeah. The whole being a normal 12-year-old, which it's actually sort of weirdly fortunate that happened, because then you get to see her normal before,
Exactly.
and then which I think hits a
Exactly.
lot more powerfully than if she had started this like when they got there. And I think it's just, but that's accidental in a way, and yeah, so I think we can see a bit of a change in certain parts where she does think about the audience, right? So she's actually thinking, I need to write this down because I'm a radio show host who wants to put together a series. But I think you're right. There are parts where it breaks down too. So it's very hard to deal with it, because I do think some of it, I don't know if you can say the journalistic aspect is cathartic as well, or so there's definitely some questions with that.
I definitely feel like her emotional part, in its own way, was a way of coping, because she wasn't really permitted by the people there to be really outspoken about her emotions. So I believe that was a way for her to talk to Kitty and get them all out.
Yeah,
So
she
while it
lost
might
her
not have been
friend.
coping in the detachment, it was coping in the way that she could express herself without having to express herself.
Right. She had literally no peer friends because Peter can't count.
Well, and her sister's kind of a
at
bum,
that point
right?
because of the feelings, but at that in the annex, right? She has no one to talk to that she couldn't get in trouble for talking to. And Margot is the occasional confidant, but not on a regular basis. So yeah, there's
Right.
definitely it's standing for a friend. Even from the beginning, it's standing for a friend, but she's faking it in the beginning, I think. The whole I have lots of friends, but I have no friends, thing. But by the time she's in the annex, there's nobody for her to speak to.
Right, and I was going to say, in answer to your question, I do believe that was her goal from the first, is just to act like she has a friend that she can tell this to, because she even mentioned in the beginning, I don't have anybody I can tell this to, so I'm going to tell it to you because paper can't judge me.
Right, paper has more patience than people, but yeah.
But doesn't every teenage girl feel that way?
Yeah.
Surrounded by people and parents and people that love them, and they're just like, oh, I'm all alone and isolated and emotional, and I don't know what to do with my changing self.
I think for the
Yeah,
first
well,
history, she was
but you're
right.
right. If you've ever been around 12-year-olds, they
I was a
they are,
12-year-old.
seriously, they are like that, and they're also they want to be exactly alike, but they want to be completely special. which is completely at odds with itself. Because how are you exactly like everybody else that's incredibly special? And then the relationships change all the time too. It's amazing she didn't have more fights with other girls she says other girls are stupid and lazy and dumb and blah and vapid, but she doesn't actually seem to have arguments with them, which is interesting, because usually that's her friends. But anyway, yeah, there's a lot of that's hormonal too.
Well, they may have been. Like, she's a pretty outstanding writer for a 13-year-old. I was talking to my boyfriend about it, and he was like, well, that's just how it was back then. I was like, no, 13 is still 13, and that is some pretty impressive, in-depth thoughts for a 13-year-old. I'm like, what should I wear tomorrow?
But she's also a 13-year-old with nothing to do, which I think also makes a difference, because this is pre-TV, first of all, and then also on top of that, to be stuck in a place for several years where there's nothing to do. I would think that you would have a lot better time for honing your writing skills.
You need to cut her down. Be like, oh, she wasn't that special. Calm down.
Well, yeah, I mean,
When you have to sit still for that long.
Well, even before she goes into hiding, there's some
I'm not saying she doesn't have anything. I mean, when we get to Essie Hinton, she's also a teenager when she writes her stuff. I mean, there are people who are so extraordinarily great when they, are younger, but it is possibly one of the reasons why this continues, But let's get you off the